And little by little under socialism, what happens is, instead of everybody on the ship rising, everybody on the ship slowly starts to submerge because they can't keep the programs running. And we simply look even within our capitalist American society to see those government programs that start off with great aplomb, where we're told about the great undertaking that the government now is promising. And then it turns out you look a few years later down the pike, and somehow, like the Section 8 housing, we were going to be providing all this great housing for people. And somehow these areas now become centers for drug trafficking. What happened?
Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Philipp. Today we have with us Rabbi Dov Fischer of Young Israel of Orange County. And Rabbi, it's a real pleasure.
Really nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
And we're here in the Orange County office of the Epoch Times. And we're going to talk today about how do we deal with these, of course, discrimination, racism. I think part of the big narrative in society right now is the idea that the personal is political. And a lot of people talking about discrimination, which it does exist, and racism, which it does exist, believe that this needs to be solved through force or through government, and not through our own individual efforts.
Well, thanks, first of all, so much for having me. You know, I have a yarmulke, sometimes called a kippah, marks that I'm an Orthodox Jew. And as an Orthodox Jew all my life, I've encountered people who like Jews and are very nice to me, and some people who despise Jews, who discriminated against me. So on a very personal level, when people get into identity politics, I know what it is to be part of a minority group that sometimes encounters disadvantages. Even more so because our own rules as Orthodox Jews inherently disadvantage us. We can't work on Saturday. If you need to hire someone who's going to work 7 days a week, or on Saturday, you're probably not going to hire me. And even if you don't need that, many times, like as a student in college or grad school or on the workforce, sometimes even if you don't have to be in class or at work on Saturday, you want to use Saturday to catch up on whatever you're behind on. And I don't have that option because Saturday is my Sabbath. So I've faced disadvantages. And the way that I've always handled it is not by whining about it. I don't blame anybody else. I just know I have to figure out how to do my best and make myself so valuable, whether it's as an attorney, as a law professor, whatever I might be doing, to make people want to give me a chance so that they say, we don't know how he's going to get it done because he says he doesn't work on Saturday, but his resume and his achievements show us that he probably can pull it off. Let's give him a chance. And that's the way it is in America, because everybody encounters disadvantages. And everybody, even those with the so-called white privilege, the so-called white Anglo-Saxon Protestant privilege, any human being knows that life can be unfair. And the difference, in fact, the secret to America's greatness always has been that we don't whine. We just bear up to it. If it takes another day and another dollar, and if it means working a little bit harder, you just make it happen. And that's what you teach your children. Don't whine to me. If you want to succeed, study harder. Don't tell me that's a bad teacher. You got your assignment, go home and do your homework, and just do as well as you can. That's why I'm not very sympathetic to those who try to divide us with identity politics. I think we all have a chance.
This is an interesting idea of how do we deal with things that are uncomfortable? How do we deal with setbacks or what appear to be walls in front of us that block us from achieving what we want to in life? Now, I can say even my generation, I'm 35, when I was a kid, if I cried or ran into trouble and was whining about it to my grandpa, you know what he'd say to me? He'd say, suck it up, quit being a wimp. And you don't hear that culturally anymore.
By the way, when you have a grandpa who says, suck it up, one day you end up with a television show. In other words, had you not sucked it, had you had Gramps saying, oh, you just cry and cry because life is very unfair and everybody else has advantages and you're never going to get equal chances, you wouldn't have a television show. You'd be sitting, maybe watching it, and maybe not even watching it, but out on the street complaining how life never gave you a chance. You have to suck it up.
Yeah, we just had a recent show with a black entrepreneur, and he was talking about his whole line is how the race card has expired. It was John Guyton, if anyone's interested. It's a great video. And he said the race card has expired, and his big thing was saying, going back and looking at the way that we're taught to default to our race or our identity in terms of assuming that we're going to be discriminated against and viewing this as things that prevent us from moving forward in society. If we convince ourselves that we can't do something based on something beyond our control, then you're never going to achieve anything. And I guess what would you say to that concept?
I believe it so strongly because, it's interesting. When Barack Obama was elected president, there were those who initially thought he would be the post-racial president because really, really America had gotten beyond racism. We had solved, and at that moment in 2008, we had solved this country's race issue. This no longer was a country where blacks are supposed to use that bathroom and whites this bathroom, blacks use this water fountain, whites use this water fountain. By the time I was growing up, going to college and beyond, grad school and working, if you were Latino, if you were African American, whatever, that didn't mean that you don't have the same chance to get hired. With all the decades of affirmative action programs, having made it possible for people of all groups to be going to college and grad school and beyond, it had finally reached a point that we really were post-racial, where when I work in a law firm, if I happen to be working on a case with an associate who's black or who's Latino or whatever the group, or Asian, doesn't matter. We all know here's our deadlines. We've got to file our motion by this day. It has to be written compelling ways. It has to be argued in an effective way. You're going to meet the client. You'll take the deposition. No one's thinking black or white or blue. I never felt that as a student in law school that my professor was looking upon me differently because I wore a yarmulke, nor did I ever feel that any professor was looking at another student in class differently because of color or religion or anything. And then suddenly something terrible happened here from 2008 to 2016, where we suddenly started getting a message out of Washington that started to emphasize this identity politics thing again, and suddenly began dividing us. And it's a terrible thing, and it's really not an honest thing. If I see a person who's blonde, I won't lie and say, I didn't know that person had yellowish hair. Of course I notice it. If I see someone blue-eyed, I won't lie and say, I didn't notice that person had blue. It never occurred to me. Of course I noticed the blue eye. And if I see someone black, of course I notice the person's black. So it is not that we don't notice differences. Just as when people see me with my yarmulke, of course they notice I'm Jewish. But the thing is, that doesn't affect the way we look at people, even though we see that. We don't treat them based on that anymore. We don't treat people blonde with the assumption that, oh, a dumb blonde. Or we don't treat somebody black or Latino differently. It's just not in the mindset of the average American person. And that's what's so terrible. The idea that the media redefine, they tell us that's what we're thinking, and we're not thinking that. And they want to tell us that this country still is broken down based on identity. It's a terrible thing, Josh.
Now, when they talk about this idea of institutional racism, it's funny. It's a buzzword that doesn't have a strong. It has an emotional power to it, but it doesn't have a strong concept of what they actually mean by it. Do they mean that racism is in the political institutions? I'd say no, because most political institutions tend to be pretty dang progressive. Do they mean it's in the way we perceive things? Maybe. What would you say to people who talk about this institutionalized racism?
I agree with you. The idea of institutional racism is so irrelevant to the United States of today. You just gave the perfect example, the universities. Do you know how you can tell whether your professor is liberal, progressive, or conservative? You can tell because if your professor discusses politics in class, the professor is liberal progressive. If the professor is conservative, he or she, for some reason, never discusses politics. I'm a law professor. I never discuss politics. The institutions themselves now are such that the liberal progressive narrative dominates, whether you're talking about the institutions of the media. That's a powerful communication vehicle, whether we're talking about movies out of Hollywood, theater out of New York, Manhattan, whether we're talking about television, news, and entertainment. All the major vehicles today, in fact, even sports other than baseball and hockey, you now have it within everything from the NBA to the NFL, where if a basketball player wants to speak a left-wing agenda, like both a socially, not only politically, but a socially left-wing agenda, like a LeBron James or like a Colin Kaepernick, if you want to bow down at you want to put on a knee at the national anthem. So that's really cool. And you might even get a really great multi-million-dollar contract from Nike. But if you really go out of your way to be a patriot, not referring to the football team, but to be someone who loves the flag and country, that's just not cool in the NFL anymore, or the NBA. So there's not only not institutional racism, it's just the opposite. The America of today is one in which people with conservative, traditional, Christian values, Orthodox Jewish values, really feel the pressure to mute our sincere beliefs. You can't even say something, I don't know if I even want to say it now. I know I want to say it, I don't know if I should, but you can't really say that there are only two genders. There's males and there are females. And that's what the book of Genesis tells us, that God made man and woman, two genders. You want to speak about institutional values now, you can't really say that. You can whisper it, but you can't say it.
And so we're at a state now, as you mentioned, where on a few levels, the systems, the government, and the culture are telling us that we should ignore what we see, what we know based on science, and what we believe based on religion, in order to service this agenda that makes us recognize a reality not based in reality. Now, why do you think they're doing this? What do you think the real agenda here is?
They want to remake the society. No one's more overt about it than this Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Unlike others who don't spell out what they're about, she, because she's new and young, she just tells you what's on her mind. But what they're trying to do is to remake the society, to change people's thinking, not only through persuasion, by having better ideas, but by forcing you either to believe something or by reading you out of the society's power institutions. For example, if you're conservative and you want to be a professor of a social science, in order to get the job, you have to apply, and then you're interviewed by the department, other professors in the department. Well, if all the other professors of the department now are liberal progressive, they just won't hire you for the position. Now, if you're that desperate to get that position, you have to hide your beliefs, your personal beliefs, and you can't give voice to them until you've been teaching for 7 or 10 years and get tenure. So that's one example. You want to write, you want to be a journalist, and you want to get to the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN, you won't get a position unless you keep your mouth shut. Every one of these publications and organs has one token conservative, let's say. So maybe New York Times might have a Bret Stephens, and maybe the Washington Post has Mark Thiessen, and maybe each one of the CNN for a while had Jeffrey Lord, and then they fired him. What ends up happening is, unless you're able to be the token conservative, you have to completely suppress what you believe. And that's really what it's all about. They're trying to forcibly change the way Americans are because they want to create a socialist country. I'm not just using that as a name. I'm not calling someone a name. I'm not saying, oh, you're trying to make it socialist. I truly am saying that they want to recreate the economy into a socialist economy and recreate the way we think. And they want to do it, of course, mostly by changing a whole generation of the young people going through the universities now and the colleges, and at the same time suppressing those of us whom they couldn't get the first time around. They just want to take us out of the system. It's a terrible thing.
And I know that as someone who's lived in Israel, Israel, of course, used to be a socialist country, and they got out of it. And I think there's some very interesting lessons from that.
Israel in 1948 began as a socialist country. She faced a very unique founding challenge. All of a sudden, being founded right after the Holocaust, she was taking in all these survivors from the concentration camps and the DP camps, the displaced person camps after the war. So she's taking in people from Germany and Poland and Russia and Ukraine, and these people talking German, these people speak Polish, these people speak Russian. Nobody understands each other. None of them speaks Hebrew. Meanwhile, as soon as Israel was created, all the Arab countries in North Africa kicked out all their Jews, and there were about 800,000 Jews kicked out. So you've got Jews being kicked out of Egypt and Libya, Tunisia, Syria, Iraq, Persia, Iran, and they're also speaking different languages. And everybody's all of a sudden in this country that has to figure out how are we going to make it financially, economically, and culturally with so many people all having landed at once from all over the place. There were Jews from Yemen who came with like 9 wives because they had polygamy in Yemen, and it was allowed in the country and permitted in Judaism as well in certain circumstances. So they had cultural issues, theological issues, and they did initially start with socialism for the purpose of just making sure that people don't die in the streets and getting everybody initially incorporated and integrated. But it didn't take more than about 20, 25 years till they realized we've got to undo socialism because we will never become a great first world country and economy, and we're losing our best people who flee this country once they have a great idea and do not want the government taking control of the idea and suppressing it. When Benjamin Netanyahu became finance minister in the 1990s, he instituted a revolution that turned Israel into a capitalist society. And I lived in Israel when it was socialist. And I don't think a lot of Americans know what it is to live under socialism. When you live under socialism, they tell you, and this is what happened in mid-1980s Israel, you can have a washing machine, but you may not have a dryer because somebody in the government decided you need a washing machine nowadays. But it's their opinion that you can hang your clothes on a clothesline. Let's say I have the money for a dryer. You don't need one though. So why should you have one if the next guy doesn't have one? In the same way, you can have a television. Everybody should have a television. But you don't need a VCR, which in those days, for those who remember, used to have something called VCRs for VHS tapes. Why can't I have a VCR? Well, the next guy can afford a TV, but not a VCR. So you shouldn't have one either. You know what? You can have one, but you'll have to pay a 100% tax. That is, if it costs $300 for the VCR, you'll have to pay $600. And they had they even had it on food, cornflakes. You're allowed to have cornflakes, but you're not allowed to have Rice Krispies. Why can't I have Rice Krispies? I like Snap, Crackle, and Pop. I've always wanted to hear what it sounds like in Hebrew. Snap, crackle, and pop in Hebrew. Well, some guy sitting in Haifa has decided the Jews of this country can eat cornflakes, but you don't deserve to have Rice Krispies because the guy next to you doesn't have Rice Krispies. But if you really want them that much, you have to pay 100% tax. So it costs like $20 a box for Rice Krispies. So like for my birthday, my wife gave me a box of Rice Krispies. It was the best birthday present. And by the way, Snap, Crackle, and Pop, it sounds the same in Hebrew. What ended up happening is I came back to the United States in great measure because I suddenly became aware I can't do well under a socialist economy, in a socialist system. And I don't want to see that happen to America because I grew up in this country and this is a great country and we don't want that.
Now, and I know a lot of people, when they talk about socialism, they think it's like a communal system. And I know that there are some people who have trouble separating that idea from traditional cultures such as Judaism that do have a strong kind of community system to them. How would you describe that, the difference to people?
I learned about socialism, as I said, living in Israel. So I'll give you an example. You have socialized medicine. What does Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren call it? Medicare for all. In socialized medicine, first of all, nothing is free. It's getting paid for some way. Well, the government pays for it, right? Yeah. Where does the government get the money? From your taxes. So right away, people begin to realize, it's interesting. Here in Israel, you're paying 30, 40% income tax on a $7,000 salary. Okay, it's not like you're a multi-gazillionaire and now you've got a higher tax rate. Even at $7,000 a year in the 1980s in Israel, you were paying a 30 to 40% tax. Why are our taxes so high? Because we get everything for free. Oh, so it's not really free. That's number one. Now, instead of me, the patient, the medical patient, deciding, how do I want to spend my money? What insurance do I want? What kind of medical care do I want? The government is deciding for me. So the government collects all of our tax money, and then they decide to create a health system. And here's an exact example of what we went through. We were living in a new Jewish community in Samaria. As a brand new community, there was an outbreak as they were building. There was an outbreak of hepatitis A. Most Americans, most people don't know the difference. Hepatitis A, B, C, D. Hepatitis A is kind of in the framework of like chickenpox and the measles. It's not the kind of hepatitis that people are terrified of dying from. It's more like a communicable disease that actually comes from publicly bad sanitation. And with a lot of building going on in construction at the new settlement, new community, there was some sewage going in the streets. So it turned out in those days, mid-1980s, the best way to avoid getting hepatitis A was you could get an immunization known as a gamma globulin injection, gamma globulin. So we went to brought the family to the doctor, and they explained that under government guidelines in socialized medicine, we are not allowed to give gamma globulin injections, immunizations, until there's an epidemic according to government standards of epidemic. Well, what's that mean? Well, you need to have, I'm making up the number, let's just say 20%. It has to be when 20% of the people in the neighborhood have the disease, then you can get the injection. So wait a second, 3 people just got it, a 4th one's been showing symptoms. You're saying we can't get it until like 28 people get it? That's right. So what happened for the next 3-4 weeks is you're walking down the street and you're finding out Schwartz just came down with hepatitis A. And then you find out Steinberg just got hepatitis A. And then you find out Goldstein just got hepatitis A. And you have this mixed feeling. On the one hand, you're feeling terrible for Stein and Schwartz and Goldstein. And on the other hand, you're feeling, okay, we're almost at 28. Pretty soon, we just need 3 more guys to get it, and then we can get inoculated. And unfortunately, the last one, number 28, was my wife. Meantime, I had a friend, Dan. Dan lived a block away. And I one day was saying to Dan, are you scared as heck about this? Like, you got 3 kids. And how do you feel about this crazy thing? He said, I don't have a problem. My dad's really rich. He lives in Chicago. And he just flew all of us in to get the injections. Oh, so in other words, really rich people, Dan, like you, can get the injection under a socialist economic system of healthcare. But those of us who aren't really, really rich, we can't get a simple inoculation. And that was my education. I wasn't jealous of Dan. That's not the way we work. I rather gained an enormous education as to what socialism is. In socialism, the rich people, they're still going to get all the stuff that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders say they're going to take away. They're always going to get it. And I'm not jealous. It's that the reason they got rich in the first place is because they're smart and they know how to play the system the right way. So they're always going to get it. They'll have private medical care. They'll always get the best. When Ted Kennedy tragically was stricken with a terrible cancer, he got the best possible care. He didn't say, well, you know what, I'm a kind of liberal socialist progressive. I'll just go to the local urgent care and see what they can do. And that's the way it's always going to be. And that's what I learned about socialism. It's not just about, oh, let's have summer camp and put our arms around each other, sing Kumbaya, and you know what? Let's roast marshmallows together. Socialism is really different from the way it's described, because here's what ends up happening. The government, let's say, has certain objectives and beautiful plans, and they begin the first day and the first week and month with their beautiful program. And then they begin to realize they're running short on money. So either they have to raise taxes, which is the first thing they will do under socialism. At some point, it gets back to the old Margaret Thatcher thing about how at some point you just don't have any more of other people's money to spend. And when the government no longer can bring in more money, it then has to start cutting back on the promised programs. And little by little under socialism, what happens is, instead of everybody on the ship rising, everybody on the ship slowly starts to submerge because they can't keep the programs running. And we simply look even within our capitalist American society to see those government programs that start off with great aplomb, where we're told about the great undertaking that the government now is promising. And then it turns out you look a few years later down the pike, and somehow, like the Section 8 housing, we were going to be providing all this great housing for people. And somehow these areas now become centers for drug trafficking. What happened? Well, when you gave people something for nothing, if they didn't have to pay for it or they got it mostly as a government gift, little by little what starts happening is they don't care for it the way I care for my home, because I have to pay for it, and one day I'm going to have to sell it. So it's going to have to maintain a certain kind of maintenance. In the same way, if you give me money, you guaranteed me an income, food stamps, this, that, the other, I'm going to work less. Of course I'm going to work. It happened to me in Israel. There was a point where I started saying, why am I working so hard at 3 different jobs? I just figured out if I drop 2 of the 3 jobs, I'll be eligible for certain government handouts. I'll come home with the same amount of money. Yeah, it'll be a little bit less, but it won't be taxed. So I'll be coming home with the same amount in government handouts as I would get from 3 jobs that are being taxed to the point that it kind of comes out the same. Little by little in socialism, when you guarantee me certain minimum incomes, I have less motivation to work hard. And so I produce less. Many people here in California are wondering, what's the deal with all the increased homelessness and more homelessness? And we're spending more and more money on the homeless. Why isn't that solving it? In fact, the more money we spend, the worse it gets. Well, I'll tell you why. Because if I'm homeless in North Dakota, where they're not paying me to live on the streets, and I happen to hear that California is paying you to live on the streets, and they're providing you meals. And by the way, it's a lot nicer weather in California than in North Dakota. So I'll come into California. Next thing you know, anybody homeless, come on into California. We pay you to be homeless. And what ends up happening in socialism, therefore, is while it all sounds very nice, at some point, the government is not able to provide all the things it had hoped and promised. And the individuals in the society who start to speak up against it, well, the government leaders begin to say, this man is a danger to our society. We are trying to create a noble, egalitarian society, and he is speaking against it. He has to be arrested. And she has to be arrested. And he and they, and the next thing you know, they're arresting people who speak about the injustice of denying people the ability to rise above. The next thing you know after that, they're being executed. And I'm not just saying it. We now have about 100 or 200 years of socialism history to look at. Every socialist experiment, the Soviet Union, Mao's China, Hugo Chavez's Venezuela, you name it. socialist societies always end up at the end arresting people, executing people, and having poverty and seeing their economies driven down to the ground. And that's really, in the end, what socialism is.
Now, tying this back to identity politics, one of the sayings is the personal is political. How would you say identity politics tie into the socialist agenda?
Well, once you start trying to convince yourself and convince me that because you're a member of Group A or B or C, therefore the government has to make things all equal and guarantee you this. Well, first of all, by guaranteeing Group A and B and C, automatically, by virtue of birth and identity, the same thing that Group D and E have, you're now doing several things. You're suppressing Group D and E. Let's say it's the white male. You're suppressing the white male. You're telling high-achieving white males who get, let's say, great results on their scholarship aptitude test to get into college, we're not going to let you into the colleges of your choice because we're going to make it equal. We're going to create through identity politics, we're sorry, but as hard as you work, you can't get in. You're now bringing in other people who have not scored as high. I will grant, once in a while someone may come from a disadvantaged, whether it's because of black or white or Catholic or Protestant or Jew or Islam, once in a while someone may come from a disadvantaged background where that person truly, through interviews and through other objective symbols and demonstrations, really might have something unique to offer. I'll grant that. But what often happens, this is an interesting thing people don't talk about much. Justice Scalia said it, and they called him a racist for it. Imagine you have a school, Harvard or Yale Law School, and they decide we're going to take in a certain person from a certain discrete insular demographic group because, well, we just ought to do it because of identity politics. So you bring in someone who maybe doesn't quite have the numbers on the SAT and the high school GPA that matches those of everyone else in class. What will happen during 3 years of law school is that person very possibly will fail out. And by failing out of Harvard Law School, that person will end up never being a lawyer. And I don't know what's going to become of that person in life. And if Harvard hadn't done that, and instead that person had gone to a middling school or a lower than middling law school that was suitable and appropriate for those numbers, that person would have made it through that school. And no, that person would not end up on the US Supreme Court, but that person would be a fine attorney and would have gone through life as a fine attorney. Every single year, we see people who have been admitted into certain schools that the schools said because of identity politics, we want to give them this extra opportunity, and you weren't doing that person a favor because that person was not cut out to succeed on that school's level. Although that person would have been fabulous had the person come in a notch or two lower. And you know something? There's a lot of greatly successful people running this country today who don't come out of Harvard and Yale, but from lesser law schools, let's say, and lesser medical schools, and lesser this and lesser that. And they're doing great. And they're leaders in this country because they went to the schools that were right for them. And then there were other people who were given a break and given a favor and we're told, no, we'll do you something better. And they were ruined by that. So that's another example of how you take identity politics, you merge it with certain socialist ideals, and you end up actually hurting people. Socialism hurts people. It actually hurts people. When you tell me, I work 3 jobs. I'm a rabbi of a congregation, Young Israel of Orange County. It's an Orthodox Jewish congregation. I'm a professor at 2 law schools, and I'm a contributing editor at the American Spectator. Once you start taking away my incentive to work by telling me, why are you working so hard? We can guarantee you the following income. Just take one of the 3 jobs and you'll get this stipend, you'll get this food stamps, and you'll get this benefit. You're taking away my incentive to work, and I'm just one person. Do that to 100 million Americans, and you suddenly turn us into a middling country again. And that's what was happening under the last president.
And also on the idea of identity politics. Of course, again, we do deal with racism. If government is not the solution, how do we... Now, this is what I'm getting at. Growing up, of course, I'm mixed race, and my brother, I'm mixed white, Filipino, Hawaiian. My brother looks very, much more Asian than I do. And he used to get discriminated against. But growing up when we were kids, you just dealt with it. If the kid was your size, you probably fought him. If it wasn't that, you just ignored it. A lot of times we just laughed at it because it didn't bother us. And we're being told these days that having someone call you a name is somehow like detrimental to your well-being. We didn't care about it. It wasn't a big deal. And if it was a threat to us, we dealt with it by just, fist fighting or something if we had to. And it's an interesting culture these days where people seem incapable of, one, tolerating discomfort, and two, dealing with problems themselves. Now, I'm curious on your perspectives on how we should deal with these kinds of things.
I agree again. First of all, because I wear a yarmulke, on Saturday, the Orthodox Jew on Sabbath does not drive a car. We walk. And therefore we walk to synagogue, we walk home. It could be a 20 to 30-minute walk. And it's happened 2 or 3 times in my life. Not much, 2 or 3 times. I'm walking down the street, and a speeding car passing by, you hear someone yell out the window, "Jew bastard." What are you going to do? First of all, that big hero is going 40 miles an hour, and after yelling "Jew bastard," speeds up to 80 miles an hour to get away, because maybe the Jew bastard on 2 feet is going to go and catch his car. So what do? If you start showing that you're upset and angry, maybe you give him a little bit of a victory. He feels better. So first of all, I learned early on, you don't react. You just make believe you didn't hear it. So he had no victory. That's how I had to deal with it. Now, sometimes when you fight back, as you probably learned in having to once in a lifetime fight back here or there, you might get beaten up a little bit back also. But that's how we dealt with it. We didn't cry, we didn't whine. I'm not on your show now 40 years later to whine about how no one has ever been nice to me, and they took my yarmulke off and they wouldn't let me read my book on the subway, and life is not fair. It's just not the way it goes. You have mixed background, I have my background, we all have that background. And I never really grew up feeling like I hate America because you don't give us an even. All I ask for is a chance. I'm not sure I always got an even chance. I just wanted a chance. And I think once you give me a chance, now you've motivated me. Okay, you're not going to give me an even chance, so I'm going to just have to be better than other people in order to come out with an even chance. And that's what also makes America great. For me, for Italian immigrants, for immigrants from Poland, from Germany, from Ireland, all kinds of backgrounds. No less now people coming from south of our border who come in legally from Mexico, Guatemala. Just give people from, you mentioned the Philippines, Japan, from Korea and from China. Just give people a chance. That's the greatness of this country. One more thought on that. It just strikes me, you're telling me our country is racist? When's the last time United Kingdom had a prime minister of color? Italy, prime minister of color. France, all these countries in Western Europe. How about the other side? Russia, Ukraine. When's the last time the Russians had a prime minister, a president, a head of the Soviet Communist Party of color? This country is unique. Everybody gets a chance in this country.
If you were to leave our viewers with one message, one point, what do you really hope people take home from this?
That's a very long question. That's a very short question with a very long answer. But I would say the main message from this discussion that I've enjoyed having with you is that America is a great country. America is great because it gives everyone a chance. We have had some parts of our history that we should not be proud of in the past. And that's okay to say that we all had a growing, as a country, we had a process of growing and learning how to be better. The way we treated African Americans slavery is despicable. There's nothing to talk about. It's nothing to even mince words. Slavery was despicable. And it's something that we had to come to terms with. We should not forget how many hundreds of thousands of white men died fighting to put an end to slavery, by the way. We had times when we did not treat some of our North European immigrants right. We do not have a proud history of how we treated people from Asia. We put 110,000 Japanese Americans into the camps during World War II, some of the most loyal Americans who actually fought with incredible American patriotism overseas against the Japanese emperor. We did not allow Chinese people to become countries. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we did not really allow Chinese people in any decent numbers to become American citizens also until World War II. But the focus that every American today should be feeling is, my goodness, notwithstanding that background, look at the country that we have evolved into and the society that we evolved into. By proceeding on capitalist principles and also Judeo-Christian values, we give people a chance. Everybody is given a chance. Through that, everyone is motivated to come up with his or her own great idea and to achieve his or her own dream. There's limitless possibility in this country. To the degree that people run into obstacles, there are aspects of life that are unfair, and everyone's life is going to have, since the time you were 5 years old and your parents punished you for what your brother or your sister did, life has been unfair. And if you'll say that never happened to me because I never had a brother or sister, well, if you didn't have a brother or sister, that was unfair. And if you were the firstborn, that was unfair because they always blamed you because you were older and you should have known better. And if you were the thirdborn, well, that was unfair because you always treated me like the kid. And if you were the secondborn, that was unfair because I was always the middle child and you never gave me the opportunities of the oldest and you never gave me the sweetness of the youngest. Life is unfair. And if we focus on what's unfair and we whine and we want the government to make it better, it'll only get worse. It's only by accepting the idea that this country lets you be everything you want if you try for it. That would be my summary of what I was saying today.
It's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Really like to meet you.
Great, thank you. I'd like to get you on again sometime.
Okay.
Great. Everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. Click that notification bell. You'll get alerts when our videos are published. See you next time.